Hello and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality, the challenges it faces, and the ideas that guide it. I'm your host Jana Jöns, a climate policy researcher at Stockholm University, and this podcast is part of the GreenDeal-NET network and the EU Climatic Project. Today we are continuing our series on democracy and climate change produced in collaboration with the Retool project. In previous episodes, we've explored how strengthening democracy goes hand in hand with more ambitious climate policy. In this episode, we take a different perspective, turning the question around to examine the pressures climate change itself places on democracy. What happens to democratic systems as climate impacts intensify? How do natural disasters shape political trust, participation, and stability? And can democracies actually withstand the pressures of a warming world? To explore these questions, I'm joined today by Daniel Lindvall, a researcher at Uppsala University whose work focuses on the intersection of democracy and climate policy. Hi Daniel, thanks so much for joining.
Hi Jana, thanks for letting me be part of your podcast.
It's great to have you on. So as I said, you worked a lot on democracy and climate politics. So maybe my first question to start with is, how do you see this relationship between climate change and democracy?
It's complex, both because climate change is affecting many aspects of society, and also because democracy is a concept that is sort of interrelated with many aspects of society, and it's a concept that when we speak about democracy we might refer to, say, a very narrow aspects of democracy is the election process and the political decision making, or democracy is something wider, talking about some people would include democratic norms and civil society, media freedom, rule of law. So it's very much a question of what we encompass when we speak about democracy. But it's complex in that situation because it's an interrelation between the many dimensions of both climate change and political systems.
You're right, it's two very big and complex issues, of course, that tackle like a lot of things on both sides. You know, climate change is such a multifaceted problem or challenge, as you mentioned, but then also democracy itself. What do we actually mean with it, or which aspects, some aspects of democracy might be more vulnerable to climate impacts than others, perhaps. So maybe to make it a little bit more specific, when you think specifically about natural disasters, and I know you also looked a little bit at natural disasters in the past. If we sort of take more of a historic perspective, what can we learn from sort of this impacts and the effects they had on democratic systems in a broad sense of the word?
Before entering into that, just to say that when I speak about how climate change will impact democracy, I think it will impact in many ways from the specific natural disasters and the more sort of like aspects that are connected to the heating of Earth. The difficulties of that will be placed on food production and other public health aspects and so on, and all this have, of course, connections with say economic and social development, and that has indirect applications and implications on democratic development. And to disentangle these connections it's quite difficult because it's very, it's different between different say societies depending on how severe impacts climate change is posing on them, and also what kind of institutional and economic capacity every society has. So it's very difficult to say something in general, but I think what we can say as researchers is that over the last couple of years, of course, climate change, global warming is accelerating, and the effects of global warming and climate change is becoming more and more obvious, and especially natural disasters have become more severe and frequent. So this is, of course, nothing that we should be happy about, but as researchers, at least there is more evidence for us to study the sort of interconnections and the causal consequences between climate change as such and say now what we're talking about, democracy. However, of course, many of these sort of connections I mean, climate change is perhaps affecting aspects in society, like, say, I mean, social relationships in society and income gaps and so on, which have indirect connections with democratic stability. So it's quite difficult, of course, to unpack everything that happens there. And that's one of the reasons why when I wrote a book about this, I felt like I wanted to start by focusing on natural disasters as such. Perhaps because they are interesting in itself. I mean, as we could say that they are some kind of like social shock to society, and it's interesting to see what kind of social and political responses these social shocks could lead to. And by focusing on that, we can also sort of isolate, to some extent, the effects of direct effects of climate change. So that was that was an introduction to your question, and now back to your question. Your question was, what can we learn from previous examples of natural disasters, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. I think you're right in pointing out that climate change is not only these shocks, but also, I guess, more of the warming and living on a planet that warmer, and a lot of these things are more, I guess, incremental or changing how we do things. But yes, then when we specifically think about the shocks, which I think is what a lot of people still associate with climate change, or when it becomes really visible for them at least, right? When there's floods or droughts or whatever. So then when we look at these shocks in the past, like what we can then learn from it.
Yeah, I think when I started to look at this, my intuitive understanding of this was that the shocks will be would have negative impacts on democracy, because they generally are negative, of course, for society, as they, of course, I mean, natural disasters like hurricanes or floodings, they affect society in many negative ways. Of course, they cause damage on infrastructure and human well-being and so on, and that should that should in some, I mean, the understanding we have about economic development and so on, and democratic development, I mean, the correlations between that is, if you have shocks that are negative for say economic standards, that should be negative for democracy as well. And there is some evidence that kind of like repetitive disasters are negative for democracy. We can see that in some countries, like, for instance, there's a study of island states that show that island states that are climate vulnerable for natural disasters, they have, like, if you look over the bigger picture, a more likelihood to progress in a negative direction after natural disasters in terms of democracy, in terms of institutional capacity. Aspects of corruption is often like negatively affected. It's of course very different between different countries depending on institutional capacity and economic capacity. But generally, we can say that these effects are negative. However, if you look at there are other studies looking at the wider picture, all types of countries, and generally we can see that there are some effects that could be interpreted as positive in short-term perspective, because from the perspective of democratic development, because what could happen in this situation is, social shocks like disasters are unexpected events, and they can create a situation where the power structures are sort of like renegotiated unintentionally. And that kind of renegotiation in some countries where, say, weak democracies, these renegotiations could open up an opportunity for new actors or new social agents or political agents to emerge, or new correlations between agents to emerge. And that renegotiation could take a positive turn from a perspective of democracy. The other effects we do see is, which is quite common, is that you have those disasters occurring, and what happens at the grassroots level is often that people are not pacified as some people might expect. Rather, people are often activated by the disasters, and they tend to be willing to do things and help out, to engage into the relief efforts or the direct reconstruction and helping each other. And that's something that could boost the civic engagement and participation in society. So if there are civil society organizations already present, these organizations could see that there's a mobilization around them, or there are new sort of organizations being formal or less formal being sprung up. And thirdly, which is also a bit counterintuitive to what people are, maybe normally envisaging these disasters to be, is that we often see a situation where people start to collaborate with each other, rather than, you can have a situation where there's a lot of political or criminal activities, where these sort of where you could have violence, but generally speaking, often these events can have a sort of they can create some kind of consolidating effects on society, where people start to collaborate, even in polarized society. And this could, of course, be positive from a democratic perspective. So I think these aspects, and I can also mention a fourth aspect, if you allow me, because what we have, there's not a lot of research on this, so I'm saying this from from sort of a few studies of disasters through the years, through historic records. So including even earthquakes and stuff that are not directly connected to climate change. But there is also an effect that we've seen in research, is that so if we have this engagement where civil society becomes activated, there is also a tendency that the activities that are initially connected to the disaster as such can be politicized in the course of time. Partly because the engagement in civil society or grassroots level are connected with existing political organizations. That is, if there is a political, say that the disaster has targeted an area that is sort of under some kind of suppression, or feeling that they are left behind, then the disaster can sort of connect with that political movement. And they'll say the engagement that is triggered by disaster can be politicized and connect with that movement. And the disaster as such could also it becomes some kind of lens through which people are evaluating other grievances in society. So you'll have something happens that shocks society, and people start to become aware about say injustices or grievances or aspects that people were not satisfied with prior to the disaster, and that is sort of like emerging up again. And this is sort of like some effects that could play in the hands of democracy, but it could also, like, of course, it's not evident that there will be vitalization, but there could be.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that comprehensive answer. It does seem then that there's like a few factors, like you said, these four that could potentially play a role, right? Like the frequency of natural disasters, but also the communities around it, and maybe how present civil society or how political civil society already is in sort of, maybe also then the response from the government. Like all of this together creates a very complex cocktail of understanding these issues. As you mentioned before, there are some differences between countries and regions, right? Also in terms of vulnerability and everything. And then there are sort of these factors that could have an impact on the democracy or the quality of the democracy after or during natural disasters. So then if you could think a little bit about, are there maybe some societal conditions that when they are already in place, these climate impacts are more likely to serve as opportunities rather than as challenges for democracy?
Yes, of course. I mean, normally, if you have a society with fairly stable institutions, governmental institutions, and a society which is already democratic, then the likelihood of the political and social institutional response to be constructive is much higher, and there are several studies like that. It's even like countries with low-level low-level corruption and strong institution, and democratic countries have even like a lower level of casualties after disaster. So these aspects, of course, play a part. Also, I think it's very important that the disaster responses as such, whether it seemed to be fair and seemed to be non-discriminatory, is very relevant. But then I think these sort of like, if you can say it, like a positive democratic vitalization effect after disaster, what we can see is that they are normally kind of like short-lived. So there's a window of opportunity where democracy can vitalize. The problem is, of course, in low-income countries and countries with weak institutions, and countries that are climate vulnerable, that have a high likelihood to be experiencing renewed disasters. Then, of course, that the chances of using, or the prospects of using, that window of opportunities are, of course, much more limited, and there is unfortunately a risk that we could see that these countries will have much. It will be much more difficult for them to profit from these kind of, like, if you would say, constructive effects of these social shocks. That's what I can draw from the research out there, at least.
And in a way that makes sense, right? Or it's sort of a shame because it does seem to then lock countries in a negative spiral where a natural disaster hits, but there's no capacity to really deal with it, or there's no civil society around it. And then if people can't really capitalize on it, well, of course, if you are more in a healthy democracy where there is political trust, then you might have a different sort of community engagement around it as well. So very, as we mentioned before, very complicated or also difficult to see. And it always feels a bit weird to talk about climate change as an opportunity as well, given how horrible it is and will be. But thanks a lot for that. Then maybe I have a final question, also more on like a positive note, perhaps. And that is there anything that gives you hope for the future in this, I don't know, maybe trying times we're living in currently?
I mean, there are many things. I mean, of course, looking generally of where we're heading now with climate policies in Europe and the US, it's unfortunately things are not moving in the right direction, and it makes me really concerned, especially the connections with democracy that we see, that the forces that are pushing us backwards are also political forces that are acting to undermine democracy. So that's really concerning. On the other hand, which I'm not sure if I would say that this is positive, but it's at least something that I think that we need to look closer to in the future. And I think that there is, I mean, the climate change is still very much still a concept. I mean, it's becoming more and more tangible and evident for more and more people. So we're not talking about climate change as a scientific fact. We're talking about something like a social fact that people experience. But the next step will be that people experience climate change in a more maybe a severe way. In many countries where you can see people are, I mean, in the United States, we can see that already, that people are sort of socioeconomically trapped, in the sense that people have bought a house, a property in an area which is now, you can't afford insurance, property insurance. You might not, well, when that's happened, the value of the property depreciates and you can't sell it, and there might be other effects of climate change that sort of like conditions the way your social position in society. This is of course not positive, but it becomes a situation where people might need to act and come together, and these situations, maybe they can become like conditions for new types of mobilization. And that's I'm not saying this is something that I'm looking forward to, because this is a very it's not a very optimistic scenario, but I think this is starting to play out in more and more parts of like high income countries, where you do have people ending up in a situation where they can connect the actual effects of climate change and this social inequalities in society. And when that's happened, because I think the problem with climate, the climate movement is, of course, it's always difficult to mobilize people broadly on an aspect that is seen to be abstract, or has been seen to be abstract for many people. But when it's connected to aspects of fairness and justice, not on an abstract dimension, but directly, then I think that is something that has a tendency to mobilize people much strongly, and to be that could be transferred into a political movement, because that, I think, what we have right now is a situation which makes me positive, is that we have a lot of effective technologies that could help us to replace fossil fuels and create a more sustainable future. But we don't have the political solution. I mean, we don't have the political agents that can drive this at the speed that is needed. and implement it in the technology in a way that could transform our societies in a social just way. And I think if these situations comes together where people can connect the dots, then maybe that could be a starting point for a more wider social mobilization. I don't know. That's my take. I don't know if that was more negative. I don't know.
It was kind of positive, and I think when you said it, it also reminded me of the things you said before, and it's also perhaps a good reminder for us to. It's good to keep talking about climate change and everything as is, and try to build our own community. So then when we are feeling these impacts and everything more, then we can also build these communities and work towards political solutions and everything as well. And I think you're so right in pointing out that we have most of the technical solutions we have. But a lot of it is now a question of political choices and lifestyle changes. So once we get to that, everything will be fine. Thanks so much, Daniel, for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Jana, for the podcast.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal.net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.